G'day, mate. 40 here. Did you know that our democracy is under assault? Our rule of law is under assault. Did you know that big law is under assault? Won't you please help? Won't you please help the attorneys? They're under assault, guys. Right, our institutions, they're under assault by the Trump administration. Right, that is the dominant media narrative that Donald Trump, in completely unprecedented ways for a president of the United States, he is bullying big law. Won't you have some compassion for big law? Well, the media realizes that you don't care about big law, but it's the rule of law that's under assault, that it's cherished American freedoms that are now under assault by Donald Trump. It's the freedom to have legal representation. Apparently it's under assault, that everything that we should hold dear and love and respect and value, it's under assault. On the other hand, there might be alternative ways of looking at this. So, for example, professions, right? They tend to try to maximize their own self-interest, just like all the rest of us. They just are more effective and cohesive. So there are tasks that nurses could do that medical doctors keep just to themselves, so that they can increase their power, their prestige, and their income. All right, there is prescribing of medication that many, if not all, doctors are perfectly capable of doing, but prescribing of medication is kept just for a certain number of doctors, so that the power and prestige and the income that comes with this can be restricted. Right? There are tasks that non-accountants can do that accountants keep to themselves. There are tasks that paralegals and secretaries can do that lawyers keep to themselves. Right? Everybody's out to maximize their self-interest. It doesn't make any one particular group here bad. Populism, and Donald Trump is a manifestation of populism, this appeals to a sense of a united people, as opposed to rule by elites. Elites cannot rule on their own. They depend upon a disunited people. The more disunited the people, right, the more ability elites have to rule, because they can then pick off various segments of society and make alliances. So we have been principally ruled over the past 50 years by a high-low combination of our elites and our least economically productive, our lowest class, have formed together in the coalition of the Democratic Party, and now almost all of our institutions are in the hands of the left. And so Trump is pushing back in ways that are unprecedented and maybe even troubling. So here's an analogy I would give for what's going on with Donald Trump and our institutions like big law. So homelessness, you may have heard, is out of control in Southern California, in California, on the West Coast in general. And so if you want to get rid of a homeless man on your block, right, are there ways that you can do it within the law? Not very easily. But if you tell the police, hey, this homeless man, he exposed himself to my wife, he exposed himself to my kids, and let's say you lie, but just that allegation will have sufficient force that the police will take you seriously, and they will remove that homeless man, right, from your block. So in increasingly bureaucratized society, in an increasingly credentialized society, in a society with dropping levels of social cohesion and social trust, where text messages and emails get leaked, all right, that occurred between private individuals, but they get leaked to promote a political cause. So when you have ever lower dropping levels of social trust and social cohesion, when your mere membership in some kind of men's-only group, which would have been completely socially acceptable 40 years ago, it now places you in peril, right? You want to reduce your legibility. You want to make it more difficult to track you. So the wise man does not belong to an all-male organization. He only goes off on, say, informal all-male retreats, or belongs to informal groups, not formal, legible groups. And to restrain the powers of big law, which have become overwhelmingly lined up against people on the right, Donald Trump is engaged in bullying, right? He is engaged in unprecedented behavior because the only ability of the right and of conservatives and of trads right now to take over institutions is from the top down, right? They can't go on the long march like the left did because leftists are really good at sniffing out conservatives, non-leftists, and they make it very difficult for them to advance in the institutions that the left controls. So here's the thing: when you hurt someone, they rarely respond proportionately, right? You deliberately step on someone's toes, they do not tend to respond simply by stepping on your toes. Instead, they escalate and they look to attack you in a way that you're not expecting, where you don't have your defenses up. And this is what Donald Trump is doing, and the left does not particularly appreciate it. So here's a discussion on Trump versus big law.
That, listening to Real Clear Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Andrew Walworth. Our condolences, of course, go out to our family and friends in Utah. Don't go away. We'll be back with more Real Clear Politics right after this.
Oh, man, I didn't have my
Welcome back to Real Clear
stamps.
Politics on Sirius XM. I'm Tom Bevan, co-founder and president of RCP. Joined now by Richard Porter. He's a contributor to Real Clear Politics, a former committeeman from the state of Illinois. Richard, good to have you. Always good.
Good to be here, Tom.
So, Richard, you wrote a piece about big law, and big law has been in the news quite a bit lately. Lay the groundwork here. What is big law, and why has Donald Trump decided that they are an institution that he wants to tangle with?
Well, big law is a reference to the very large law firms that service corporate America and Wall Street. And there's probably 100 really significant law firms. And, this is kind of a moniker that's given to those law firms that really specialize on big business deals, big business litigation. And the law firms have grown to be like the people they've been servicing. And so they're quite large and international in scope and really, I think, represent the.
So my Chrome browser was starting to run sluggishly, and I got rid of my two extensions. One was the Google Art Project. The other one was some type of ad block. And restarted my computer and tried using the internet without ad block, and it was just absolutely unbearable. I couldn't take it, so I added on the ad block. And so it's an example of lowering levels of social cohesion and social trust, and people will start making ethical shortcuts. And so a part of me thinks it's the ethical thing to do to allow ads so that the websites that I like to patronize, that they're able to make money. But when there's just this ongoing assault on a normal use of the internet, right, the regular bloke starts putting up his defenses. And when you have a monolithic institution like big law that is overwhelmingly on the side of the left, then a bloke like Donald Trump and his administration, right, they start taking some unprecedented steps to try to even the score.
The elite element of law. And I think to understand what's going on, you have to look at the very first piece you posted this morning, Tom, which talks about how Trump has launched a war in all elements of elite culture. And so I think that what the Trump administration perceives is that the big law firms are kind of part and parcel, almost like the hub of what's been happening in terms of the politicization of business and law generally. And so I think that this is an extraordinary move designed to try to drive politics out of business. And by trying to get out of business, they're going after the law firms that service them.
We ran a post the other day by this guy, Jeff Clark, who it was on X. We ran it on, I think, over the weekend on the front page. And he talked about his experience in big law and how essentially, the left sort of captured all of these elite law schools. And then those folks moved on to sort of capture a lot of these law firms. And he mentioned that, there used to be some semblance of balance. There used to be kind of not necessarily 50-50, but over the past few decades, I guess, that's moved.
So all the professions are on the left. Lawyers about 2-to-1 on the left, but there are no right-wing law firms, right? The left dominates all of big law, right? There are no Republican equivalents to big law firms that are in the control of the left. And so this is the conventional narrative, all right? I want to contrast the different narratives we have here. Trump's assault on elites encompasses almost every aspect of American life. Donald Trump is escalating his multi-front assault on an elite establishment, using raw presidential power to bend the government, law, media, public health, foreign policy, education, and even the arts to his will. Now, given that the right is unable to take over institutions through the slow march, their only possibility for changing institutions is from the top down, right? There's not much alternative if the right wants to remake institutions to what Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis in Florida are doing. Trump left no doubt in last year's campaign he'd use executive authority to seek retribution against his political enemies. But his attempt to transform America's politics and culture is far broader than a personal revenge trip. He's targeting Ivy League universities. He's using executive authority against top law firms. He's eviscerating the bureaucracy. He's rejecting 80 years of elite orthodoxy about American global leadership. He's using tariffs to shatter the global trading system. Right? He's forced Columbia University to restrict demonstrations, review its Middle East curriculum, ban masks in protests, and stiffen law enforcement. And many other universities feel vulnerable to attempts by Trump to impose his will. And now Trump has directed Attorney General Pam Bondi to seek sanctions against lawyers and law firms who engage in frivolous, unreasonable, and vexatious litigation against the United States. Now, vexatious litigation is already makes you vulnerable to civil litigation. But let's get a little bit more here.
So it's almost, 80-20, 90-10, leaning to the left. And the left is always championing when they're doing pro bono work. They're championing all the sort of left-wing progressive causes. And that what needs to happen is sort of a, some semblance of a return to balance, hiring of conservative, from conservative law schools or people who are conservative. Is that essentially how your experience has been in the field of law for the last 4 decades?
Well, I was very fortunate to be at a firm that was very welcoming of different points of view. And I don't know that all law firms had that same culture that ours did. In fact, I played an important role in the management and decisions about what kind of cases we would take on. So, I think you can't really paint with a broad brush. That said, I think the real target of the Trump administration are the businesses that sort of joined hands with the activists. So it used to be the business was a counterbalance to government. But about 15 years ago, the Business Roundtable and other businesses like BlackRock, they all kind of threw in with the activists and sort of joined hands with them. So suddenly there was no longer counterbalancing force within the ecosystem in which the big law firms operated. So if all the flow is coming from one direction, if it's all coming from the left, it's natural to go with the flow. And so I think that's what happened. Is what big law did was sort of mirroring what was happening in business more generally when business became more political. And so it became kind of a self-reinforcing phenomena where their lawyers sort of became the amen choir for some of what was going on. And you saw this politicization where, I was a Soviet history major in college, and one of the earmarks of the Soviet industrial model was to have political commissars in every business. And that's essentially what we started to adopt over the last 10 years, where people had these essential politicos brought into the C-suite under the rubric of DEI or ESG, and they became kind of 10 years the point of the sphere within business for the left and for the Democratic Party. And so big business has become part of the Democratic coalition. And so I think what this is really aimed at is less the law firms, but more at depoliticizing business, and they're going after an element of that ecosystem, which is going to help drive it back the other direction.
We're speaking with Richard Porter. He's a contributor to Real Clear Politics, has a piece on the site this morning about the very subject that we are discussing. He's a former RNC committeeman from the state of Illinois. Richard, obviously this was targeted. Paul Weiss is the name of the firm that's been in the news quite a bit. And so give our listeners a sense of what did the Trump administration ask of them or demand of them? What was, and because I see these stories that, they capitulated to Trump and they've caved and all these things. Help us figure out exactly what was demanded or asked of them and what did they actually agree to?
Well, I think Trump ultimately demanded for them to be themselves. And I think that's what made this kind of an interesting agreement, because if you look at what the CEO of Paul Weiss agreed to, he was basically agreeing to the principles that guide the business of Paul Weiss in the first instance, to be balanced and to hire from.
So I operated a blog beginning July 3rd, 1997. And even though I came from a journalistic background, I did not always operate with journalistic ethics. And many of the people that I was interacting with were also not always operating with the highest of ethics. And so when there was a severe enough conflict between us with one guy, Mike Albo, who's the editor of Hustle Erotic Video Guide, he was disgusted by my lack of adherence to traditional journalistic standards. And so when he got his hands on me and starts pounding my head into a light post on the street, I agreed that if I were to write about him in the future, I would follow standard journalistic protocols. So one advantage of dealing with someone in a profession is that there are standards, there are ethical codes, there are places you can go. You can expect certain things from them. And so you don't necessarily have the same standards when you're talking about bloggers and vloggers. And sometimes for a point of clarity, right, when you're at loggerheads or when someone's smashing your head into a pole, it helps to arrive at a realization that, yeah, okay, we're going to agree to some mutual standards here so that we don't have to get into these physical confrontations anymore. So when people go to a doctor or they consult a lawyer or go to a dentist or hire an accountant, right, it's helpful to have some objective standards and some type of in-group monitoring to make sure that there's some degree of reliability. The problem is the game is largely rigged against the average bloke. So I moved to America in 1977, and one of the things that jumped out at me was how much more credentialed Americans are. So what mateship is for Australians, right? That sense of camaraderie, social trust, and social cohesion that Australians enjoy, particularly Australian men with Australian men, credential seems to play that role in the United States. And Australians I knew who'd moved to America, they could not do the same jobs that they'd done in Australia. My stepmother, for example, she could not work as my father's secretary because the Seventh-day Adventist College in Australia, while they allowed that, Seventh-day Adventist College in California did not allow that because America puts up a lot more bureaucratic legislation, protocols, there's more fear of lawsuits, and so all sorts of standards that are just don't have to be said out loud in Australia, they have to be negotiated in America, right? You take on a job in America and you have to negotiate often some of the smallest things because there's not the sense of social cohesion and social trust that people enjoy in other countries. So the more individualist the society, the more you have to negotiate. The more corporate the society, meaning that people are primarily members of groups rather than just individual actors, right? Then the less you have to negotiate interactions. So in some societies, just that you're an Orthodox Jew or you're an evangelical Christian or you're Muslim or whatever your group identity, then all sorts of things do not have to be stated, do not have to be negotiated. It's just accepted that you're a member of the group. But when you're in a primarily an individualist society, and Australia is, compared to other countries in the world, fairly individualist, but not nearly as individualist as America. But the more individualist the society, the more things have to be negotiated, the more things have to be litigated, the more friction there is for transactions and interactions. So if you're in a country that has, say, 95% Han Chinese identity, I would expect that there are all sorts of things that you simply don't have to say out loud, let alone negotiate, as opposed to a multicultural, multi-religious, multi-ethnic, multi-racial society where there's not much that members of your society have in common. So everything has to be regulated, litigated, negotiated, right? Transaction costs become quite steep. And populism is an expression of the people desiring cohesion and trust and a reduction in credentialism and rule by elites and bureaucratization and litigation and government intervention and scrutiny of our personal lives. So I put these thoughts, credentialism also big in Germany. Interesting. So I put these thoughts into deep think. I remember many of my fellow Aussies who moved to America, they could no longer work in their old jobs. So one woman who was my second grade teacher in Australia, she could not teach in America because she didn't have the more extensive credentials that America required. So you can say Trump is at war with elites, right? That's one expression in the media. You could also say he's at war with a game that is rigged against those who don't have credentials. Right? You can say that Trump's assault is on the left-wing credentialed class. Right? Professions tend to rig the game against ordinary people as professions constantly strive for more power, prestige, and income by limiting and keeping out competitors. So deep think, grok, on platform X agrees. Trump has targeted the credentialed class, and the credentialed class are overwhelmingly on the left. And Trump's policies affecting education, federal jobs, and diversity programs, right, go after the left-leaning credentialed class. Right, he's cutting university funding, he's attacking DEI, and these attacks resonate with those who feel excluded by our elites, by our institutions, by credential barriers. Now, the elite news media will tell you these are all undermining democracy. So Trump has appointed non-traditional candidates. He's consistently challenged the dominance of formal qualifications and credentials, and he is largely aligning with the people in their critiques of professions and institutions that are rigging the game against ordinary people. So in the US, credentials, degrees, certifications are crucial for far more jobs than in Australia, right? So the media frames Trump's battle as a war on democracy and institutions, but you can also understand it as challenging the credentialed class, those with abundant amounts of formal education, particularly those working in the professions such as academia, media, and government. All right, so you've got the attacks on universities, federal workforce cuts, diversity programs, non-traditional appointments like Ben Carson. So you could see this as leveling the field for those without credentials. Others say this threatens democratic credentials. So in Australia, you've got mateship, right? The importance of personal relationships and trust. This is often prioritized over formal qualifications. In the US, you have much more of an emphasis on formal qualifications, on credentials, on degrees, and on certification. So Trump has consistently been elected. The primary reason that people vote for Trump is that they are not satisfied with America's institutions. If you feel that the game is rigged against you, you're likely to vote for Trump. So Trump supports reducing occupational licensing requirements, right? He wants to make it easier for people without credentials to work and to succeed. There was a 15-point swing towards Donald Trump among those earning less than $50,000 annually, right? A majority of these people voted Republican for the first time since the 1960s, right? While the Democrats, their power center is the professional managerial class, PMC, who are increasingly resented by working class voters for controlling America, controlling systems through credentials. So people who feel excluded tend to resonate with Donald Trump. So here's a summary of Trump's policies affecting the credentialed class. Policy area: media criticism. Action: labels the media fake news. Impact on the credentialed class: undermines journalists' credibility. Policy area: federal workforce cuts. Hiring freezes, agency reductions, threatens the job security of people who play the game well. Bureaucrats, right? What type of people get credentials and degrees? Right? Much of education is being good at accepting instruction and repeating back to your superiors what they want to hear. And so the ornery person is going to be less likely to succeed in securing credentials and degrees and formal qualifications. Trump is cutting the education department. This affects many university operations. He is cutting diversity programs, which tend to be most taken advantage of by those who are able to play the game. Right, immigration policies makes life uncertain for university students and university researchers. And he's made a lot of non-traditional appointments. So Trump is challenging the dominance of the left, the dominance of formal qualifications, the dominance of credentials, the dominance of institutions. And his actions are resonating with those who feel excluded by our institutions, our credentials, and universities. So Trump reflects working class versus ruling class tensions. Now, somewhat related question. Let's say you've got American plumbers, dentists, lawyers, people in the sanitation industry, and professors who, let's say they all share a similar income and they are all living in the same place and they are all of the same race. Are these people going to be mates? Right? In Australia, they'd be mates. But in America, I'm skeptical that they'll be mates. Will plumbers dentists, lawyers, garbage men, or people in sanitation, and professors with equal income living in approximately the same area, right, same race, will they be mates? Because I notice in Orthodox shuls, do I have a license for this opinion? I notice in Orthodox shuls or in other synagogues that the Sephardic Jew tends to hang out with the Sephardic Jew, the Persian Jew with the Persian Jew, the Ashkenazi Jew with the Ashkenazi Jew. People who earn over $200,000 a year don't tend to hang out with people earning $100,000 a year. So it's possible, I think, that the plumber and the garbage man and the professor and the dentist might be friends, but I think it's less likely in America, right? So according to Grok, racial similarity reduces social barriers, makes it easier to form bonds. Race is apparently a strong factor in social network formation. Wow, this seems to argue that racial homogeneity or cohesion reduces social barriers, makes it easier to form bonds, increases social cohesion and social trust. All right, race, according to Grok, this is not me. Racial similarity facilitates friendship formation. It reduces cultural and social barriers. People prefer to connect with those of the same racial background, especially in close-knit communities. This shared identity enhances trust and interaction, makes it more likely for these individuals to hang out even across occupational lines. Wow, so Grok is saying super racist things, that the more racial homogeneity you have, or at least of certain varieties, right, the more likely people are to get along, the less conflict, right, the less surus, the less trouble, the less friction in interactions, the more trust, the more cohesion, the more people will work together. So Americans tend to think of social class as primarily a function of income, but I don't think that's factually correct. I think it's probably much more a function of education.
All ranges, a diverse array of legal talents, and to take on matters from all parts of the spectrum. In other words, Paul Weiss was never designed or intended to be one way or the other, as with other big law firms. And instead, what happened was there was this drift. And so basically, as with Columbia, you look at the agreement that the Trump administration concurrently was doing with Columbia University, it was demanding of Columbia that it be a university again, and that it be open to different points of view. And so the Paul Weiss agreement is really, as I say in the piece, it's sleeves off the vest, which is to say they gave nothing other than just acknowledging who they're supposed to be, which is a high-quality firm focused on legal talent coming from all directions of every race, color, and philosophical perspective. And so, look, I think it's a good roadmap for people generally, right? Politics and business don't have to be, working hand in glove. There's, focus on making widgets. It doesn't have to be political.
But, the Paul Weiss case and the Columbia case that you mentioned, right, are being sort of framed in the media as, oh, this is the Trump sort of authoritarian regime that is imposing its anti-free speech. They're not, tolerating diverse viewpoints on campus. They're squelching academic freedom, and they're doing the same. They're strong-arming these law firms into getting what they want. Is there something to that, Richard? Is this appropriate for the administration to be telling, irrespective, if you think Columbia has gone off the rails, is it appropriate for the administration to be, using the levers of money and power to be forcing organizations to do what they want? And does that set a bad precedent when, a Democrat comes in, as they obviously will, that this is going to be now the new normal?
Well, I think you have to recognize that this has been going on, this levering has been going on now for many years. And the levering has all been from the left. And it's with this ecosystem of activist groups.
So I have moved on from my relationship with Grok, just the simple Grok. I've now moved on to Grok Deep Think. And I asked Grok Deep Think, does big law love civil rights law because it enhances big law's power, prestige, and income? And Deep Think agrees. Seems likely that big law firms engage in civil rights law to enhance their power, prestige, and indirectly their income, rather than out of any deep passion for civil rights. Right? Civil rights work often done pro bono. It's usually civil rights to assist in a leftward direction, boost the reputation of big law, attract socially conscious clients, which lead to more business. So big law values civil rights law for strategic benefits, such as visibility in high-profile cases rather than a primary income source. Right? It helps with their reputation, with their marketing. and it puts their leadership out there on the cutting edge of progressive causes.
Which, by the way, many of which were funded, indirectly or directly by USAID. So you had this government activist, kind of groups working again with some big law in the pro bono space, driving an agenda towards the left. And so there was no real countervailing organizations on the right pushing back against this. And so the Trump administration is serving in that role. It's levering back against the left wing, levering from the other direction. And so, for example, with Columbia, what you see is Columbia basically agreeing that, gosh, yeah, we should protect Jewish students. What they let happen was wildly inappropriate, right? And that they ought to have some balance in their scholarship. That's the whole point with having an open university system. And unfortunately, what we've seen is once the left gets in, they want to exclude all other points of view, and they want to just make this more monolithic. So the reality is that Trump, through these actions in many different directions, is trying to open up the elite culture again, open up elite culture to different perspectives, and to make it safe for people to be conservative and to reject some of the left-wing activism that's been going through and being levered into the businesses and the universities and so forth.
All right. We are going to leave it there. Richard Porter, contributor to Real Clear Politics. Again, go read his piece on RCP this morning.
Okay, I'm a big fan of Christopher Caldwell, and he was on with Vivek Ramaswamy. Vivek's interjections did not help this conversation. I wish he'd spoken less, but provocative topic here, the price of comfort, how we traded freedom for free stuff in the West.
American immigration differs from European. We have our problems with immigration, but there are certain problems that Europe has that we don't have. Europeans tend to tell pollsters that they consider migrants lazy or antisocial, and I think that even in the United States, when we have a very difficult situation with migrants in certain places like Springfield, Ohio, that is not the critique. And part of the reason is that, just as you say, we have a nanny state that is less well developed than Europe does, or to the extent that it is well developed, foreigners, including newly arrived immigrants, have less access to it than they do in Europe. So in Europe, every newcomer has a kind of a cushion that allows him, or has traditionally had a cushion, that allows him to just sort of follow his instinct where he wants it to go. And one of the reasons, for instance, that so many immigrants get into radical Islam is that they're sort of subsidized to do it. I remember seeing a statistic a few years ago that 2/3 of the imams in France are on welfare. In the United States, there's nothing wrong with being an imam, but in the United States, you were sort of forced into the workplace, which is where a lot of assimilation happens.
Yeah, I think that's a different dynamic. And
okay, let me fast forward here through Vivek.
Europe has it has a birth dearth the way we do in the United States, except that it's a generation older. I believe that deaths started to exceed births in Germany and Italy in the early 70s, whereas this phenomenon is just getting rolling with us. So you have people entering the workforce who are of a small generation, already born of a small generation. And the need for labor in Europe is almost boundless. And you don't really see it in the
Okay, let's just get a taste of the elite media perspective on some of this. Law firms refuse to represent Trump opponents in the wake of his attacks. Now, this is concerning, but there's no mention in this story about how often people on the right have been unable to find legal representation, how big law made it impossible for any of their representatives to argue the case, for example, for a traditional definition of marriage 15 years ago. So the result has been called an extraordinary threat to constitutional rights of due process and legal representation. Super scary. President Donald Trump's crackdown on lawyers is having a chilling effect on his opponents' ability to defend themselves. Well, conservatives have suffered a chilling effect for decades in that they're extraordinarily vulnerable to accusations of racism, which makes conservatives far more reluctant than liberals to speak about cultural, political issues with strangers or in the workplace because they have no ready defense against charges of racism. So Biden-era officials say they're having trouble finding lawyers willing to defend them. Well, how often did January 6th protesters and Trump supporters and conservatives and right-wingers and Christians have difficulty finding lawyers willing to defend them, particularly pro bono? The volunteers and small nonprofits forming the ground troops, the legal resistance to Trump administration action, say that the well-resourced law firms that once would have backed them are now steering clear. So nothing providing balance in this article. It's all about how awful Trump is. The result is an extraordinary threat to fundamental constitutional rights of due process and legal representation. Legal scholars, guys, legal scholars, all right? Legal scholars say no previous U.S. administration has taken such concerted action against the legal establishment. Right? Trump has used executive orders to target powerful law firms. My God, isn't this awful? So, is there another perspective? For example, Matt Stoller, he's on the left. He's not a big fan of monopolies. And he says the Democrats' corporate lawyers get the humiliation they deserve. He says the Democrats' establishment brain was at the giant law firm Paul Weiss. And now they've bent the knee to Donald Trump. So lawyers are the Democratic establishment. Lawyers are the real thinkers and the real operatives behind Democratic politics, behind people like Minority Leader Chuck Schumer and candidates like Kamala Harris and Barack Obama. It has been this way for decades. It is systematized. Young, ambitious liberals have to get their first few years at one of these law firms, and then they can be considered a real lawyer. And a key node in this network is Paul Weiss, Rifkin, Wharton, and Garrison. It is a multi-billion-dollar entity, right? So politically connected, its New York office served as the unofficial campaign headquarters for Kamala Harris's campaign. Democratic House Leader Hakeem Jeffries worked as an associate at Paul Weiss for 6 years. He's got a donor network there. Former Obama campaign members Jay Johnson, Loretta Lynch are partners. So is Chuck Schumer's brother, Sonia Sotomayor, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Elena Kagan were summer associates. All right, a firm partner, Karen Dunn, prepped Kamala Harris for a debate with Trump. On the very same day, she opened up for Google in its ad tech antitrust case against the Biden administration. So Paul Weiss earns $7.5 million in profit per partner in 2024, the fifth highest of major law firms. It is anchored by private equity titan Apollo Global Management, as well as by Google, Amazon, and Apple. It reps 9 of the top 10 private equity firms. Just this week, it got a securities action against Amazon dismissed. It advised Rocket Mortgage in buying Redfin. It helped engineer the roll-up of roofing in the $11 billion QXO Beacon Roofing supply deal. So it's very much on the side of power and very much on the side of the left. Right? It sent a letter opposing the Biden administration's $8 cap on credit card late fees. It helped Verizon buy Frontier, did one of the largest private equity deals in China, and as an internal investigator, it failed to catch one of the largest stock frauds in history. Right? And Paul Weiss is a powerful firm, unafraid of standing up to the government on behalf of corporate monopolies or left-wing pro bono clients. During Donald Trump's first term, Paul Weiss publicly rallied the resistance against Trump. They issued a call to arms for lawyers to fight Trump's actions on immigration. Now, Trump targeted Paul Weiss with an executive order, and in exchange, Paul Weiss bent the knee. And the legal world is horrified and shocked and humiliated. So if this venerable law firm, which is filled with power, has the resources to fight and a legacy to protect, capitulates, then who else will? But from Matt Stoller, right, lefty anti-monopoly guy, he says, big law is a place of toxic, anti-democratic, small d sentiment, right? You've got big law, big institutions, the elite against the people, right? The entire edifice of party politics where fancy lawyers do the real work, right? This is a charade to hand over America to private equity and monopoly, and Paul Weiss has been leading the way. It's a story of modern corporate liberalism turned sour. It's a wildly unethical place. It flips sides on Google for money. Its lawyers openly encourage their corporate clients to break the law, right? Their top deal guy laid out the firm's strategy to address a new, more aggressive merger posture. Get as many illegal deals into the agencies as possible because there just weren't the resources to stop them all, right? The dirty little secret They can't sue everybody. Right? They push to outsource national security to companies and then represent them when they run into data breaches or hacks. So these lawyers aren't just unethical, but they are, in many ways, the reason the Democratic Party is as pathetic and enfeebled as it seems to be. Big law is the brains of the Democratic Party. Elected officials are meek pleasers with little experience wielding real power. They are just ornaments who serve up slop. The alchemy of big law was that they would control things, right? The politicians would seamlessly revolve in and out of government, but the real power was with big law. There is a deep rage in the Democratic base and on the right at this kind of oligarchy. So this Democratic corporate titan, by capitulating to Trump in return for money, has ripped out the heart that ran the Clinton, Obama, and Biden administrations. Just at the time when regular Democrats are looking for someone to blame for their own party's weakness, and who better to blame than the would-be Kamala Harris staff, a pack of Google and private equity defense lawyers, and Chuck Schumer's brother, who, when the chips were down, bent the knee to Donald Trump. Right. Left-wing perspective there. Christopher Caldwell from 8 months ago, just after the Trump shooting and just after J.D. Vance was selected as Trump's VP.
I think what they've done in practice is, present the public with a ticket that is kind of incoherent. And I think the kind of the original sin of this type of vice presidential nominee was Reagan nominating George H.W. Bush after he defeated him in 1980. And most Republican tickets have resembled that.
Because a lot of people around Trump, or people involved in the campaign, donors and so on, we understand, were pushing for more of a sort of conventional election strategy pick.
Right.
Like a Nikki Haley, like a Marco Rubio,
Yes.
like a Glenn Youngkin, and so on.
Right. The money was really behind Nikki Haley.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like, you, Mr. Trump, have won over the populist part of America, but we represent the moneyed part of America. So please give us a vice presidential nominee who represents, everything that your voters hate.
And so in a way, it was an expression of great confidence from the Trump campaign.
It was a totally, that's where the break is, this is the next, J.D. Vance is the next generation of Trumpies. And it was hard to see that for a while because he's culturally somewhat different from Donald Trump.
But there could well be some strategic thinking from Donald Trump, and strategic thinking specifically about November, because J.D. Vance is the senator for Ohio. The Republicans probably would have won Ohio anyway, but more broadly, he would appeal to those swing states in the Rust Belt, Wisconsin, Michigan, perhaps Pennsylvania, because he is a white working class boy from a very poor background. And he has this sort of beautiful story to tell about himself, which is that he managed to get into Harvard and then Yale Law School, and then served in the Marines, and then went into business, financial technology, made a success of himself there. It's a great American story.
Yes, he's a really special person, and I've met him only by doing a profile of him during his 2022 Senate campaign, and he came to into public prominence as the author of this memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which is, it was a big seller even in England. I think it's a kind of a special thing to be a hillbilly. To be a hillbilly in Ohio it's really actually a kind of a class thing in the way that you understand it in England. In the United States, when people talk about class, they're usually talking about how much money you make. Being a hillbilly in Ohio is, Vance's grandfather came from the hollows of Kentucky and came into Middletown, Ohio, and found work in a steel rolling plant. They made sheet steel. It was a factory called Armco. It's still.
So it's important to me to listen to every interview Christopher Caldwell appears in, to listen to every talk he gives, to read every article and book that he writes.
There, but it doesn't employ many people, and it at its height it employed tens of thousands of people and turned that into a middle class area. And at that point, those hillbillies, some of them did pretty well. There are people in Vance's family who have done well, who've become fairly well off, and the family itself is quite it's full of smart people. His family are sort of accomplished and impressive in their way, but they are hillbillies. They're from the middle of the country, from a city that is now just a real disaster area economically, that has very few businesses, and so they're kind of looked down on. That's why I say it sort of resembles something like the English class system, which we didn't really have that before. But Vance has a fantastic ear for that. And you're right.
So Mark Halperin is also enamored with J.D. Vance, right? J.D. Vance is the most interesting vice president we've had in memory. He's got the highest upside of any vice president I can think of in the last 70 years.
Ohio is no longer a swing state. Between 1964 and let's say 2016, Ohio voted for the winner in the presidential race every time.
Yes.
It was the ultimate swing state. In 2020, it lurched very decisively to Trump, and now it's a Republican state. But you're right, Vance has got a feeling for this class of people that will help Trump in many other states.
Well, he's
immediate aftermath of Trump's shooting, which I think is going to lead to a lot of sympathy for him, is going to make it sort of more difficult for the Democrats to have their argument. I don't know what kind of news he was consuming, but it's natural to look at the demonization of Donald Trump in a more negative light. But finally, I think that the Democrats' talking points in recent weeks have tended to revolve around January 6th, and the idea that
and my new thinking on January 6th is that no people can allow its opposition to have a monopoly on violence. Right? There's official violence, so officially only law enforcement has the legal right to commit violence, but in reality, de jure versus de facto. So de jure is the law on the books, de facto is what actually happens. De facto, the left has dominantly had a monopoly on political violence in this country going back to the 1960s, and that's untenable for any people to just allow the opposition to have an effective de facto monopoly on violence. So in practical terms, I see the strong reason for an expression of right-wing violence to try to start to even the scale. So I hated January 6th. I hated the Stop the Steal movement. I hated Trump's rhetoric about the election being stolen. But it just hit me in the last few days. No people, no side in a fight can afford to de facto allow the other side to control the streets and to have a monopoly on violence, right? The left has consistently used violence to intimidate its enemies. It was absolutely inevitable that the right would respond, not the Christian-loving ideal, but an ideal, a necessity from the laws of nature, if not the laws of Christ.
Trump or people around him or his camp constitute some sort of non-democratic threat of, upheaval or violence. And this this episode sort of neutralizes that. It sort of shows that that threat comes from both camps. And so I think it does give a lot of people a lot of food for thought.
Yes. And Democrats can't seem to stop themselves from using the very rhetoric that they pretend to denounce. I mean, for instance, J.D. Vance last night was immediately called by the Biden administration a far-right extremist. That's 24 hours after Joe Biden talked about calming down the rhetoric and so on. They do sound a bit ridiculous. Well,
it's. I mean, that they feel that has been a. I think that Democrats feel that there are social mores in place, which they call structures of permission.
Okay, so these social mores and structures of permission and careful critical discourse, all these things militate against accurately describing reality. You can't describe reality in politically correct terms. And these structures of permission and mores, they militated against noting that Joe Biden appeared obviously senile at times. And so it's this enforcement of this elite morality that Democrats have tried to use as a shield against Donald Trump. I don't think it's working out so well.
Which I think allow them to shame people out of voting for Republicans. It's not really a very classy thing to do to vote for Republicans. And it has been effective for them in the past. And it's really tough to break rhetorical habits, as anyone who observes politics will see.
Donald Trump is a very... Going back to J.D. Vance, finally, Chris, you talked about how he could be almost a kind of better vehicle for Trumpism than Trump. Perhaps I didn't.
I'm not sure that's exactly the way I put it, but he's a younger generation person, and Trump is.
Look, he seems to be smarter than Trump. He seems to be more disciplined than Trump. He seems to be better educated than Trump. He seems more organized than Trump.
Trump's virtues are those of brashness and uncouthness. They're not those of sort of like laying out things in a good explanatory way. J.D. Vance is a really smart guy. And there are a lot of people of his generation who are very accomplished and who might have the patience and the knowledge of how you run a political system to achieve things where Trump has not achieved things. So it's an open question how second generation Trumpism is going to work.
Without its king, because Trump's real appeal is that he can appeal to almost anybody, because they get this sense of his charisma, it's his ability to sort of connect with people in all sorts of ways.
At the same time, he hasn't given evidence of really being able to manage government projects, and so what was missing, whether you like him or not, in his first term was a sort of a bureaucracy that could really begin acting with a sense of purpose to enact Trumpism. It sort of shocked everyone to discover, as Trump went out to the country to demand to ask for a second term, that none of this wall that he'd kept talking about for like 4 years had really been built, or barely any of it. And
Trump, in some ways, was a bridge between kind of Bush-era conservatism and where we seem to be going now, because he watched a lot of Fox News. He buys into low taxes. He understands business people. He had before they'd started to hate him. Most of the business community liked him and admired him.
Yes, and he passed that bill, which was a Reagan-era supply-sider's dream.
Which
tax
J.D.
cut
Vance
of 2017
wouldn't
do. Which J.D. Vance doesn't like. So that tax cut came from a sort of a group that was close to the supply-siders, to Grover Norquist and other Washington figures who were big for cutting every tax possible on businessmen, and it was backed by the Club for Growth, which is a low tax lobby, which backed Vance's opponent in the Ohio primary, at which point Vance took to calling them the Club for Chinese Growth. So that's the strong element in Vance. He does have he's very interested in protecting this class of people from which he comes, and he thinks that the kind of wide open world trade and the tax cuts for the rich does not fall under that task.
Christopher Caldwell, thank you very much.
Okay, Christopher Caldwell, just bringing it once again. I thought that was a terrific little interview there with the Spectator. Okay, so a lot of narratives going on right now. How do we determine, or more importantly, who determines the winning narrative? And my bottom line answer goes back to one of my favorite sayings, this one from Thucydides, wrote the Peloponnesian Wars. The strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. In other words, the strong select our dominant narratives. The dominant select our dominant narratives. When the persons who compose the dominant change, some of our dominant narratives change with them. So Wikipedia describes dominant narratives as an invisible hand that guides reality and perceived reality. So much of what we think is reality is really just a function of the dominant narrative. So why do some stories dominate other stories? Who determined, for example, the dominant narrative of World War I? Right? How did these poets give us the disenchantment narrative to which all other English language narratives must bow? Why did this one disenchantment narrative from poets about a massive war that killed about 40 million people, why did that win out over all other narratives? And so stories don't win just because they're pretty or they're true. Right? Dominance tends to come from power, from the dominant, from who's holding the megaphone, who's got the muscle, who's got the ability to reward and punish, and who's got the knack for hitting the collective nerve at the right moment. Right? That's the answer from Grok. Pretty good. Right? The poets delivered a raw, visceral, personal narrative, and their words ended up sticking and winning because they mirrored the exhaustion and the betrayal felt by the dominant generation after World War I. So power picks the winners. The poets were powerful, they were educated, they were connected, they weren't ditch diggers, they had access to publishers, so the cultural gatekeepers could amplify their voices. The establishment adopted their disenchantment narrative. Why? Because it served their purposes. It was a cautionary tale to soothe the battered nation and to dodge blame for the carnage. So competing stories got sidelined because they didn't fit the mood or the needs of the elite. So who decides? It's a messy scrum. The dominant are not a monolith, but they're the ones with the resources and the reach and the loudest platforms. Stories also dominate because they're useful. Certain narratives weaponized. Narratives meet our needs, right? The more effectively a story meets your needs, right, the more likely you are to adopt it. So when you find a story that you love, right, ask yourself, why do I love this story? So I love the story in the Cars song Heartbeat City. Jackie, what took you so long? I thought you knew the way. Because stories of loss move me, because my most intense emotional experiences from childhood were of loss. Loss of my mother, loss of where I was living because I kept moving, loss of my friendship circle because I moved. So stories of loss resonate with me. They just cut me to the quick. When I listen to Heartbeat City by the Cars, I just want to cry. Right? I'm having a powerful emotional reaction because that narrative, that story, meets my need to feel sad and to mourn and to be neurotic. So dominant groups usually shape the winning narrative, but public response and public resonance and credibility also play key roles. When dominance shift, narratives shift often. So those with power, those in government, media, the cultural elites who promote certain stories through the most powerful institutions tend to select our narratives. The narratives also must resonate with the widespread needs of the public, must help meet their emotional needs, must feel credible, and must fulfill social needs. So during World War I, you had an initial patriotic narrative, and that was pushed by government. But after the war, the disenchantment narrative of the poets took over. Because as people learned more about the war's horrors, right, they became increasingly disillusioned, and they wanted to embrace feeling sad and bad. So stories dominate when they're promoted by influential groups. They are seen as authentic and they connect with people's lived experience. So narratives win, just like products win and people win when they meet the needs of others. Right? Winning narratives meet powerful needs, widespread needs, more effectively than competing narratives. As Ziegler says, you can have everything in life you want if you will just help other people get what they want. So winning narratives emerge when stories align with widespread emotional resonance and powerful interests. For example, why did some people embrace the woke narrative? Right? And this is sociologist Musa Al-Ghabi. Attitudes and dispositions associated with wokeness are primarily embraced by symbolic capitalists, meaning the professional managerial class, people who work with symbols. Wokeness is not associated with egalitarian behavior, right? Social justice, wokeness, discourse, narratives are mobilized by elites to legitimize and obscure inequality, to signal and to reinforce their own elite status, to tear down rivals, frequently at the expense of those who are genuinely vulnerable, marginalized, and disadvantaged. And a key part of a winning narrative is that it provides the release of tension. So I experience this again and again and again. When I hear a profound insight, when I hear a narrative that makes more sense of the universe, provides a more sophisticated and comprehensive understanding of the world outside, top down, or the world inside of me, bottom up, all right, what tends to accompany that narrative is a sense of release of tension. And Grok agrees with me. Tension released is the secret source of a winning narrative. So when I educate Grok and I point out its logical and empirical errors in its analysis of Steve Stoller, does Grok remember? Am I helping to educate and make Grok better? I want to make Grok great again. So people don't just crave stories. They crave the catharsis that comes with it. All right, people don't just want to be a star, don't just want to be rich. They want the emotional fulfillment that comes with being a star or with being rich, the sense of safety and the power that comes with those things. So it's not that people are deliberately craving stories necessarily. They crave the emotions that come with a good story. People love it when the knot in their chest or the pounding in their head or the rumbling in their stomach stops and is released, right? So a story that relieves your headache, your stomach ache, and your heartache is a winning story. So we are wired for stories that take our chaos and our pain and our longing, our deepest emotional, personal, social, and cosmic needs, and give these needs a shape and then a release. So a romance resolves longing with a kiss. A thriller turns dread into triumph when the killer is caught. And the World War I poets turned a nation's betrayal into a shared lament. Let people feel sad instead of crazy. Right? That's why it dominated. It didn't just compete, it soothed. So the winning narrative offers tension release. And one example of this was one of the first Jews at Harvard University, a transnational philologist, Leo Wiener. And his selection of his academic specialty eased his tension, right? Just as being a farmer eased the tension in his body, being a philologist eased the tension in his soul. So he came from Europe, he traveled a great deal, he was displaced from everything that had been familiar, and when he tried to root himself, he rooted himself, number one, firmly in the ground in America's welcoming soil, and simultaneously in a realm that he shared with all of humanity, language. So there was a terrific book by a female scholar published in 2007, Fighting Different Wars, Experience Memory in the First World War in Britain. She says, Janet Watson, the disenchantment of the infantry soldier retrospectively became the story of the First World War in England. But this retrospective view does not reflect the ways people talked about participating in the war when it was being fought. The war itself was overwhelmingly popular and the nation came together. So the received history of the war starts with idealistic volunteers and it ends with shattered veterans and names carved in stone on memorials. But this does not reflect the dominant views during the war itself. So how did the story of the disillusioned trench soldier establish itself as the history of the war? So the working classes saw the war as work, while the middle classes saw it as an opportunity for professional advancement, while the upper classes saw the war in terms of service. So after the war, people who had seen the war as service were the most likely to frame their memories as a store of disillusionment, disenchantment. And so it was the upper class who selected the dominant narrative of disillusionment because it met their needs. Right? So the war was not fought under a cloud of universal gloom. People rallied up, signed up, cheered it on. So the disenchantment story was one that met the needs of the upper class who saw the war primarily as service. Right, this is an interview from a year ago. Right, and this provides the background for Trump's battle against big law.
On Getter, Twitter, Truth, and my personal is at
Mike Davis. Now we're getting down to it because people should understand, since we're a nation of laws, right? When you're inside the government, everything is essentially a legal issue. It all comes, I mean, there's policy issues and economics, but to implement and execute it, this is why the place is full of lawyers. You got to be, because you got to understand everything that's going on. This story shows that CRA, Stephen Miller, other groups are putting together in that 3,000. There's going to be now teams of lawyers in there that are fighters, and not just guys going to give you some faculty lounge discussion of the Constitution. Mike Davis.
Yeah, I mean, this is critically important. You need lawyers who are smart enough to do the job, but they also have to have backbones. We need lawyers. We need an attorney general like Jeff Clark. We need a White House counsel like Mark Paoletta. We need people who know how to fight, right? And that is going to be critically important in the Trump 47 administration. Maybe he'll never admit this, but I think President Trump has learned his lessons from the first term, and that is that the Democrats play for keeps. They will destroy you, and there are a lot of Democrats within the federal government. There are about 4,000 political appointees who are supposed to manage 2 million people in the executive branch, and the political appointees are very much outnumbered. And if you don't pick the right political appointees...
Hang on. It's not just the Democrats. Let's get the heart of the problem is that the city is run by these massive white shoe law firms. It just is. Those massive white shoe law firms, their money comes from the corporatists, from Wall Street oligarchs, Silicon Valley oligarchs. This is why you've been fighting David versus Goliath on tech, and the big corporatists. All those have a progressive kind of anti-American view. And this is why if you're a lawyer, if a lawyer stands up, if Jeff Clark or Mark or Mike Davis or any of these fighters you see in War Room or other places around President Trump, immediately they're told you're going to get bounced out of the white shoe law firm. You're never going to have a career. You're never going to make the big money. The threat is real, that everything you worked on from a kid to go to a great university, to get great grades, to go to great law school, to then have the possibility of actually pursuing it at one of these powerhouse law firms is over. All you have to do is be associated with MAGA and you're done. That is why these lawyers that step up as fighters, this is a true real-time profiling courage, because you're putting your entire career and your family's well-being on the line. Is that not the heart of the problem we have? That too many Republican lawyers who know that we're right and know what they're working on is right flinch when it comes to the time to do it because they're going to be ostracized from a way to actually make a living. Mike Davis?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you want to go back to these fancy law firms and make a lot of money, you certainly have to turn on Trump. You have to write your tell-all books. You have to go do your media tour, crapping on Trump. But you know what? That's what we need to make sure.
Now, this is a video from a year ago, right? It provides the background to Trump's war on big law.
We need to make sure those people don't make it into the Trump 47 administration, particularly at the Justice Department, particularly in the White House. And I think that we need lawyers who have backbones, and that is key because it is a tough fight. The entire D.C. establishment is against President Trump, and so these lawyers are going to have to fight every second of every day.
Can we take apart the administrative state of the deep state unless we have the special forces in our 3,000 political appointees that don't have to be Senate confirmed? The special forces of those will be these lawyers. If we don't have a cadre of those lawyers, will it not be impossible to take this on and take it apart?
Yeah, it will be. I mean, the lawyers are key, and more importantly, the judges are key. And that's where the Article 3 project is going to be playing a big role in the Trump 47 administration is we're going to help President Trump pick these judges and pick these lawyers to dismantle the executive branch, to dismantle the administrative state. And it's going to be a slog every second of every day for 4 years. But it's so important that we get those judges on.
Okay, who determines the winning narrative? right? And what determines a winning narrative? And the answer, dear boy, is needs. Dear boy, needs. And what drives human needs? Human nature, dear boy. Human nature meeting events, dear boy. Events. Needs come from nature meeting events. So Joe Biden's catastrophic debate performance against Donald Trump June 27, 2024 was so devastating because it confirmed widespread but officially denied under the news narratives about Biden's dramatic decline in cognitive ability, also known as senility. So the senile caricature of Joe Biden proved more correct than what the mainstream media was telling us about Joe Biden's cognitive acuity. And then that embarrassed the political elite class, such as Joe Scarborough and Tom Friedman. So we got a narrative of conflict, right? The situation had changed. And remember, after Joe Biden's debate performance, people were saying, well, it's completely unprecedented to replace a major party presidential candidate at this point. And I stood up and I said, the situation is king. And the situation is such that Joe Biden cannot remain as the Democratic nominee. And so my situation-based analysis, right, proved correct, right? I think I had to be among the first people to publicly say that there was no way that Joe Biden could continue as a Democratic nominee and then provide a logical, cohesive argument for it that held up, I think, quite well. So you may have heard that all the world loves a lover. It doesn't. What all the world loves is a good fight. So a narrative with conflict will usually be more exciting than a narrative with peace. And there's one person who understands this, and that's Donald Trump, right? He was the star of a top-rated reality TV show for 14 years. He learned that what it takes to keep the attention of the public is conflict, conflict, conflict. When you watch a fight, you're likely to feel excited. When you watch two people at peace with each other, you're not likely to get excited. You may have heard of the song Video Killed the Radio Star. Well, ask yourself, why did video kill the radio star? Because video better met many needs than radio. Some people watch TV or listen to the radio or listen to music rather than go to church because entertainment and art better meets their need for comfort than religion. Why are advanced economies increasingly secular? Because secular alternatives to religion are increasingly more effectively meeting people's needs. And there's a sociologist back in 1966 who saw this. Brian Ronald Wilson came from a working class background in England. And in 1966, the year I was born, he published the classic book, Religion in Secular Society. So he places religion within culture. So from a purely secular perspective, religion is a subset of culture. And the best definition of religion that I've heard is religion requires interacting with a supernatural being or beings. So communism is not a religion. So in our more secular age, we have increasing numbers of new channels for emotional expression and emotional soothing. We have new ways of realizing our wishes. We have new places for us to operate in and become stars in. All sorts of things that used to be a monopoly of religion is now out there and easily available in the secular world and often meets people's needs more effectively. The scientific worldview is increasingly dominant. And when you hear religious people saying religion doesn't conflict with science, right, they are simply surrendering because they know they cannot outcompete science with most people, right? So the more the scientific perspective dominates, right, the less of life is open to the world of enchantment and religion. We have many new leisure opportunities, right? We have educational and intellectual recreation. These things were previously exclusively the province of the churches and the synagogues. We have the emergence of new forms of information technology. We have the film industry and TV and the internet, right? Entertainment in particular from its beginning has challenged religion because it offers diversion, it offers different interpretations of daily life, and it frequently outcompetes religion for the time, the attention, and the money, and the loyalty, and the emotional resonance of the public, right? And entertainment offers an alternative set of norms and values and practices. It has often replaced religion's attempt to awaken public sentiments by titillating private emotions. So the church has steadily lost its near monopoly on the media of communication. The clergyman used to be a powerful voice in his local community. Now he's just one of many voices that often give divergent religious messages and have to compete with increasingly effective voices using new technical means of mass communication, offering up non-religious distractions that frequently outcompete religion for the allegiance and the time of people who are formerly religious. We also probably have evolutionary wiring. So we're probably wired to resonate with certain narratives. Certain narratives make us feel good, right? Novels help us to feel strong emotions, right? When you buy a novel, you are paying for pathos, and you'll find many authors who are willing to provide it. Novelists will arouse pity. Journalists like to arouse intense emotions because that makes them more powerful. So we have all these conversations moving through time, and there is a small number of people who largely get to say what our dominant narratives are and what knowledge is. So many of the same people who decide what knowledge is also decide our ruling narratives. So that's the supply side. Then there's the demand side. How well does the narrative meet the demand? That will affect its power. For example, most people under duress love narratives that blame outgroups for their problems. Groups with the most power enjoy disproportionate success at shaping narratives that don't clash with the vital interests of people hearing the narratives. So we did not evolve to be gullible. Smart people can't get you to believe something that is against your best interests. We have powerful instincts for detecting manipulation. So when I think of the major news stories, I'm usually struck by the uniform narratives that we receive from the elite media. Think about the biggest news stories of the past decade. Trump represents a threat to American democracy. He's fascist. Rise of Barack Obama, messianic black guy whose election redeems America from racism. Supreme Court's taking away our right to abortion. Ukraine war caused by that evil Putin. Russiagate. Russia is interfering with our vital democratic processes. China, it's threatening democracy, and now its decline threatens democracy. And now we have the rise of Christian nationalism, which threatens our democracy.
So number one, it's phony, is that you do have to
on their own if legal cases filed by certain lawyers or law firms were frivolous. And then what's extraordinary here was that they could then enact sanctions against the law firm. And one of the key things that came out over the weekend was there was this criticism of a law firm that sort of settled with Trump, Paul Weiss. They were one of these law firms that were targeted. And it wasn't just that, the Trump administration is talking about taking away Paul Weiss's federal contracts. They said that any company that continued to work with Paul Weiss would have its federal contracts taken away. And the head of that law firm said that he settled with the White House because they were going to be forced out of business. Steve Bannon said last week the goal is to bankrupt law firms that challenge this administration. No president has done this. Ronald Reagan didn't do this. George H.W. Bush, George Bush didn't do this. And so it's just unprecedented and alarming to a lot of lawyers and legal experts.
So the head of Paul Weiss, and this is the firm that Trump had leveled an executive order against that essentially had crippled the firm's ability to do business, sent a long message to his staff, to his fellow attorneys at his firm on Sunday. And it was the second time since Thursday that he had sent out one of these. And in that message, he tried to explain why was it that he had gone into the Oval Office and made this deal with Donald Trump to end this executive order. He had taken a lot of heat about it in the press and in the legal world for doing this. And that was especially acute because he himself had been such a prominent Democrat. He was someone who raised money for Joe Biden. His firm had helped prepare Kamala Harris for the vice presidential debate, and he himself had tried to harness the powers of the legal community against Donald Trump when he was president during his first term. And in his message was a pretty revealing claim, and that was that even though judges in the federal level, or at least one judge, has said that this executive order is no good, it was too risky for the firm to actually go to court to fight that, because they would have lost their clients, that the firm's clients would have thought that the firm was persona non grata with the government, was out of favor with the administration, and it would take its legal work elsewhere. And to me, it showed a remarkable power that Trump has developed in his executive orders, that he was able to get a firm that easily could have gone to court to fight something, to instead go to the Oval Office and make a deal with him, a deal in which they committed to giving $40 million in pro bono legal services to causes that Trump himself has championed.
Front pages of the papers today. You've got the New York Times. The Times has a picture of the Pope on the front page, also talking about how disturbing it is that law firms that may not agree with the president being targeted. David Rhodes here to talk about that. Also, Wall Street Journal editorial page at the top, gelling of Erdogan rival Spurs protests in Turkey, and really does. And also, very interesting, a headline right here that's really, we also are seeing in the Financial Times this morning, too, that people are starting to park their money outside of U.S. stocks, or longtime fans of U.S. stocks are parking their money elsewhere. This is on the front page of the Financial Times. Trump tariff trimmers shatter Wall Street's faith in American exceptionalism. It's something that we were talking about on Friday, and it really is remarkable what a couple of months difference makes. I know you, Mika, you saw when I came back from Britain, came back from Europe, and I was talking about how they were in awe of our economy in December, and just saying, my God, there's no way we can compete with you. You have all the animal spirits. We've lost all the animal spirits. It's just the opposite now. I was speaking yesterday to a man who has an American who has business in the U.S., but also in Germany. And he's just talking about the fact that in Germany, things have been so flat, but now they're waking up to history and understanding the United States doesn't seem to want to be there to help them out. So
the chilling effect is already there. Even if indeed a judge does step in, a court does step in, the message has been sent by this White House. If you defy us, we're going to make your life miserable. Now, these a law firm like this, clients of that law firm now may think twice. Do we really want to work with them? Maybe we'll go somewhere else now, somewhere less controversial. So there could be a real issue for that law firm. There could be a chilling effect elsewhere in the legal community. And Mika, we talked about this on Friday as well, but this is one of the top examples just about, frankly, how much more clever the Trump administration is being this time around in terms of using the levers of government, the levers of power, creative ways to get that retribution, to get that revenge, and to defy others to challenge them.
This is the primal scream of a dying regime. Pray for our enemies, because we're going
apparatus in this country, which is completely run by left-wingers. And Paul Weiss, and this is what I love about this, we're now getting down to it, both on the financial side and on the legal apparatus, and taking on the administrative state and the deep state. President Trump has a full-on assault on the elites of this country and the elite institutions that have turned against the American people and demonized the American people, made their lives miserable, made their lives economically much harder, took away the futures of their kids. He's now turned around and he's going after that, hammer and tong. And they're folding. They're not powerful when you confront them. CNN has an entire
So before Trump took office, I said I got two major concerns about this new Trump administration. One, that they'll be incompetent, and two, that they'll be corrupt, meaning levels of incompetence and levels of corruption beyond the normal. And this chat on Signal between many of our top foreign policy officials is a startling example of arrogance and incompetence, just the very thing that I was fearing from this Trump administration.
Article from Stephen Collinson, who is the smartest guy over there. Never see him on camera. Don't know why that is. Hiding. But he's talking about Trump's going, and he goes through every part of the elites. It could have come from the script. In fact, I think he lifted that from, he must watch War Room because he's lifting it from War Room, but that's okay. We needed to get out to the CNN crowd. President Trump, full on. The cabinet meets at 11, this is all tentative. Cabinet meets at 11 o'clock. We will go live there to see if President Trump does one of his open-ended press avails when the cabinet's seated. House is back at noon. Have to know if the political pain is worth, if the candle's worth the game. I assume it is. Full of Trump haters, put on by Trump haters. Never Trumpers and Trump haters. He goes as a federal judge. His conflicts are legion. Laura Loomer's done such a great job, not simply as arms surrendered. I cannot emphasize enough how big this is to shatter, and the head went down as a supplicant, one of the biggest Trump haters. President Trump said, hey, why don't you come down, let's have a meeting. Let's talk about this face to face.
Right, talking about the head of the Paul Weiss law firm, a bastion of the Democratic Party,
where he signed the surrender document. And now you got these grundoons in the law firms, these associates sending emails out. I need over at Skadden Arps, some young woman. I need to know immediately if you're going to kowtow because this considers my 2 weeks notice. Hey, baby, don't take 2 weeks notice. Go now, leave now, because all those firms are going to be out of business. President Trump is on a full-on assault of the elite capture of every institution in this nation. And they fold immediately. He threatens to take the money away from Columbia, and just a taste. It was $400 million. They get billions. 60% foreign students. Your kids don't have a shot. All these universities, all these institutions, your taxpayer dollars, your kids are on the carrier battle groups and in the Hindu Kush and in Romania with the 101st. On Okinawa with the Marines in Korea. Everywhere. Your kids, sons and daughters, protect them. Your tax money goes to underwrite it. Your pension money goes to finance it. You are the guarantor of all this, and you're abused by these elite institutions that go ever been. Short break. Back in a moment.
Saturday, the president issued a memorandum called Preventing Abuses of the Legal System and the Federal Court. Mm-hmm. And this was President Trump saying that his administration, the Attorney General and the Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security could decide on their own if legal cases filed by certain lawyers or law firms were frivolous. And then what's extraordinary here was that they could then enact sanctions against the law firm. And one of the key things that came out over the weekend was there was this criticism of a law firm that sort of settled with Trump, Paul Weiss. They were one of these law firms that were targeted. And it wasn't just that, you know, the Trump administration talking about taking away Paul Weiss's federal contracts. They said that any company that continued to work with Paul Weiss would have its federal contracts taken away. And the head of that law firm said that he settled with the White House because they were going to be forced out of business. Steve Bannon said last week the goal is to bankrupt law firms that challenge this administration. No president has done this. Ronald Reagan didn't do this. George H.W. Bush, George Bush didn't do this. Yeah. And so it's just unprecedented.
They didn't do it. It's unprecedented. They didn't do it because it was all controlled opposition. And the reason Ronald Reagan didn't do it is because Jim Baker and that Bush crowd were running the deal. And he's part of his big law firm guy. If your clients continue to retain you, we will pull their government contracts. Boom. This also shows you how many are on the tit. This is Ed Dowd's going to join me. Scott Besson. Finally, we went on offense. Over the weekend with Scott Besson, laying out exactly the debacle that Biden has left the country, left working class people, Main Street, until we stop this massive government spending. Maybe the way to do it is just raise the billionaires' taxes and the corporation taxes. Big law firms that are all stocked by the top law schools. It's a whole system. And that judge at the top, and that's why I say, hey, I love ISA, but if Johnson's going to use that to pat us on the head, we don't need a pat. Let's go full impeachment. Why not? Let's just get it out there. The impeachment process itself will expose us 75% of the time we win. And even when we lose, it's just temporarily. We got resilience. World Bank, like the IMF, like NATO. Genius. Not just you, but anybody who retains you is going to be eligible for a government contract. Did you see David Rose say that? It was almost like he had a heart attack. This is the way you only beat them by hitting them upside the head with a 2x4. That's a metaphor. Don't want to put their heads on pikes. Metaphor. Oh, so good. Just don't back off. All gas, no brake. Impeach this dude. Don't sit there and get. I'd love to fact yes the thing of the rogue judges, and that's important, but it's not as important as putting somebody through the process. You put one through the process, they're all going to be sheep. Put one through the grinder. Let's put the guy that tried to step between the commander in chief and his duty of the national security of the United States, of which I don't know. The polling's 80-20 that we're winning on this one. I think we want that one. Let me see. Let me pick A or B. I'll take B. Don't deflect, Johnson. Grow a set, and let's come in and let's get on it. Roger Kimball, you've been around the neighborhood a while. Is Stephen Collinson right at CNN? This is the biggest assault on elite institutions since at least Andrew Jackson, sir?
Well, reading that piece, I couldnn't help but laugh. It is a perfect epitome of the ethic that only we are allowed to do these things. You can't do that. Only we are allowed to do these sorts of things. It's a kind of Mary McCarthy sort of essay. You remember that Mary McCarthy once said about Lillian Hellman, the playwright Lillian Hellman, the communist playwright Lillian Hellman, that everything she said, including the words "and" and "but," were lies. That's what this piece is like. It's hilarious, really. Beginning with his deployment of the word elite, what he means by elite is credentialed. It's the credentialed class. It's the class that has, abrogated to itself all of the societal perks and power, and they feel like they are in charge. So, for example, you were mentioning Colombia earlier. Somebody organized a joint letter signed actually by some people who I know and respect. I'm surprised they signed it. They basically said the government may not threaten funding cuts to pressure recipients into suppressing viewpoints and so on. Well, what has the government been doing ever since, the Great Society, Title VI, Title IX? They said, if you don't do these things that we want you to do, that, transgender bathrooms, having women in sport, men in women's sports, and on and on and on, we'll take your funding away. So that is exactly what Donald Trump is doing here. They said, it's not McCarthy. That's the New York Times had a piece of this is a McCarthyite tactic. No, it's not. He didn't say you're not allowed to say these things. It's just if you do, you're not going to get government funding. Quite right, it seems to me.
Exactly.
Exactly. And then, this is it's an extraordinary. I might write about this essay. Every single line is either a lie or a misrepresentation of what's going on. He said, well, the Trump administration is trying to disempower the federal judiciary. No, it's not. Article 2, the first line of Article 2 of the Constitution says the executive power shall be vested in a president of the United States. One. Doesn't say a president of the United States taking hints from district judges in Tennessee or Seattle or Washington. No, it's a president of the United States. And the author of this piece talks about alleged gang members. Well, they're not alleged. They are gang members. They're not migrants, as he said. They're illegal immigrants who are raping and murdering and assaulting Americans. Among my little cabinet of world leaders who I admire, Mr. Bukele is, top of the heap. He completely, revolutionized El Salvador. It used to be one of the most dangerous countries in the world. Not anymore. He put him in jail. And I'm glad that these guys from Venezuela who were here trying to assault Americans, I'm glad that they're in that jail. And I don't see where this district judge, where all these judges, where do they get the jurisdiction to say that they can impinge upon presidential power, executive power? They somehow feel that if they're sufficiently anti-Trump, that makes them susceptible to, acquiring little bits of executive power, but it doesn't. It's an extraordinary piece, and I'm glad you called my attention to it. Every line of it, right down to the insinuation of the argument ad Hitlerum. Toward the end, he talks about dark parallels between the Trump administration and the tactics of strongman leaders like Viktor Orban. Viktor Orban has transformed his country into, one of the greatest countries in Europe now. It's an extraordinary piece.
You're at the forefront of these institutional and how important it is for President Trump to leave our mark, the populist nationalist mark on our institutions, particularly Kennedy Center and other institutions of high culture. Just as an update, President Trump goes. Do we have the President Trump piece at Kennedy Center? Is that ready? Not yet. Oh, it is ready. Let's play Trump at Kennedy Center.
Okay.
Hey, let's play the clip and I'm going to bring
including the seats, the decor, pretty much everything. Needs a lot of work.
Mr. President, are you surprised by the reaction that the Vice President got here at the Kennedy Center for the other day?
I don't know about that. He's the most popular Vice President we've had in years. He's done a great job. I don't know anything about it. I figured you'd ask a question.
Mr. President, what are we talking about price-wise to renovate, bring it up to...
Well, we're looking at that, whatever it is. I think, it's such an important part of the fabric of the country and of D.C. So we want to do it right. We'll do it right. We'll do it once. So you want a little picture like this? Perfect. Go ahead. Are you guys ready? Come on. We're good, sir.
Sir, you want to speak to us later, too, when we're closer. That would be great. Perfect. Thank you, Press. Right this way.
President Trump very subtly there sending the message when he goes. Very subtle from the presidential box. Roger, it was very important for President Trump to go, and he's now chairman of the board. Rick Grinnell's president. But just the trend line, so you know that, JD, the vice president, went with his wife, the second lady, on last week to see the symphony, and they were booed by the paladins of the administrative state. However, I've got breaking news. Sergio Gore and his posse went last night to the Mark Twain Awards where Conan O'Brien got the award, and they weren't booed. People just glared at them for 20 minutes as they walked into the administration's box. So the trend line's good. How important is us for take culture back, sir?
I mean, it's you mentioned Andrew Breitbart earlier. Breitbart was right. Politics is downstream from culture. We need to recolonize American culture, restore it. And the Kennedy Center is one beachhead. I thought it was hilarious to return to this CNN piece that he talked about elite bashing sentiments that Trump is expressing by, for example, naming Robert F. Kennedy, to his position. And then they add, of course, a vaccine skeptic, not really explaining what Kennedy's position on that is. But the idea that Robert F. Kennedy is, a member of an elite bashing coterie is hilarious. But the idea that somehow Trump's whatever he's going to do at the Kennedy Center, that he is attacking a bastion of high culture, is ridiculous too. I mean, this is the place that has drag queens for divas and that sort of stuff. It is a playground for the leftist credentialed class, and it would be nice to take that playground back for our own. I mean, again, I just want to stress it. The people should understand that what is actually happening now is the reason that the left is so up in arms is that they're not used to this. Only we are allowed to do these things. They say, you can't do it. Only we are allowed to do this. But Trump has taken a different page, and he's doing it to them. And good for him.
Roger, where do people get you? Where do they get your writings, your columns, your social media, all of it?
Okay, that was Roger Kimball, I thought, making some good points, but let's get a little bit more here.
It was about Columbia University makes concessions to Trump amid bid to reclaim federal funds. Just that shows that Columbia University is for sale in the time of Trump, just as the law firm Paul Weiss seems to be. Quote, Columbia University agreed on Friday to make changes to its protest rules, campus security policies, and Middle Eastern Studies Department in a remarkable concession to the Trump administration, which had refused to consider restoring $400 million in federal funding without an overhaul. What's interesting is if they embarked on their own to do those things, they could. And I'm not at Columbia. It sounds like there was an appetite for that among its own student body, but to do it under duress makes them look so weak.
Well, and it seems to come back to the same thing. It's about money. Oh, you're going to withhold funding? Okay, we'll back down. Oh, Paul Weiss is going to lose clients and it will affect our business? Okay, we'll back down.
Why not just end DEI without Trump, holding you to it in the Oval Office?
Right. It's one thing if the law firm and if the university, if they actually believe that these are the proper actions to take and those are principled, that would be one thing. And it's not to say that there shouldn't be changes necessarily to how those protests were handled and that there were some Jewish students who were on campus who felt unsafe. It's not to say that they shouldn't be addressing these things, but it's the circumstances under which they're doing it where, you're only when you're going to withhold our funding are we then willing to come to the table and concede everything. At some point, you have to stand for something, and it seems that the university here and the law firm did not.
As this story is sort of reverberated around the legal community about concerns that a law firm went in and buckled so quickly after Perkins Coie was, in there fighting and again needing some receptive legal ears in the judge that reviewed that EO.
So I think this will be not just the first law firm to cower and surrender. I mean, they're the first, but they will not be the last. Paul Weiss is a Goliath of law firms. Like, this is one of the top law firms in the country. And when a law firm that is that powerful and has those kinds of resources at their disposal, when they say, no, we're not up for the fight, even though it's a slam dunk case and you already have another judge in it with the essentially same executive order saying this violates the First Amendment, the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, this is totally unconstitutional, it's blatant on its face. When you have that kind of a record and this law firm says no, we're still going to cower, we're still going to surrender, that sends a message to all the other Goliaths and all the Davids that you do not want to fight this. And what I found particularly troubling, there was a piece in Mike's article in his reporting where the White House made a statement saying that when Paul Weiss, as chairman, went in to talk to Donald Trump, that he acknowledged wrongdoing from the prosecutor, their former law firm partner, who then went on to investigate with the DA, Manhattan DA's office, went on to investigate Donald Trump and recommend charges against Donald Trump, that chairman, that he acknowledged wrongdoing on behalf of that prosecutor, and then said that he also acknowledged the grave dangers of weaponization and the need to restore our system of justice. Now, I don't know, it wasn't clear to me whether or not that actually happened, but I have not seen a statement disavowing that White House statement from Paul Weiss. That should have been disavowed immediately if it didn't happen, because that is outrageous. What did Mark Pomerantz do that was so bad? He left the law firm to go and investigate the former president for crimes and recommended that he be charged with crimes. And by the way, he ended up being convicted of 34 counts in that case. It ultimately went to trial. So where's the wrongdoing here? That I found troubling because, look, Paul Weiss can say, look, this is pretty innocuous. We're agreeing to do things in pro bono work that we already do, so this is all just not a big deal. It is a big deal because the reason they were targeted is because of these actions from a former partner and also another lawyer from that law firm who took on a case representing others against January 6th rioters. They're being targeted. They're being punished for those democratic causes. So when you then take a step back and you don't fight the slam dunk case, you are essentially neutralizing yourself and you're telling others, we're not going to take on these potentially illegal actions that this administration is going to take on. We're going to step back from that. We're not going to defend against that. And we are not going to defend others who may need help. I mean, that is the message that you are sending. And not only that, you're taking it a step further and you're saying we're actually going to now align ourselves with causes that Donald Trump finds acceptable that are mutually agreed upon. You're sending the message you're essentially now in his pocket in some way. And that is so deeply troubling. It kind of raises the question when you see these law firms, big, powerful law firms backing down, when you see universities seeming to back down, members of the media, it's like, who is going to meet this moment? Like, who is going to do it? Yeah.
Mr. Vindman, you're on the list. The White House put out a statement yesterday revoking security clearances for a number of individuals, saying it is no longer in the national interest. And you are on this list. Your reaction to the White House naming you in this absurd and very bizarre statement?
Sure. Thanks for having me on again. But I'm not a weak-kneed billionaire that could be bullied around. I'm not a massive D.C. law firm with nearly unlimited resources that could be brought to heel by some empty threats. I haven't had an active security clearance for 5 years. And guess what? I revoke the
Am I a bad man for rejoicing in the downfall of my enemies? Rejoicing in the downfall of about the most powerful, most affluent law firm in the United States that has consistently deployed its resources on behalf of the Democratic Party? Am I a bad person for rejoicing in their humiliation? I don't think that makes me a bad person. I think that just makes me human. All right? Now, if I was in a social engagement with someone who is feeling a lot of pain right now about this, I wouldn't I wouldn't try to increase their pain. All right, I wouldn't say things, I wouldn't say words or use a demeanor to increase their unhappiness. But the normal, natural thing is to delight in the humiliation and the downfall of your enemies. And if you are not on the left, like, how could you not be thrilled by what's happening with the second Trump administration? Just so much more competent than the first one.
President's revocation. I reinstate my security clearance, and because it's meaningless. I mean, it's noise. It's Friday night theater is what we're seeing here, because they're running out of really cool plays, so now they're going digging deep. And
look, when you have your most intense sexual experiences with your spouse, right? When people have their most intimate interactions, they're not primarily driven by a desire to unite with God or to be kind and sweet and gentle, right? When people make love, they don't tend to be very loving. One thing I love about Judaism is how open we can talk about the frequently nasty nature of human orientations.
it's pretty absurd where they're headed. And frankly, I don't care. This is not something that's loose liberal, right? Frankly, I'll make fun of it.
This is the primal.
Going to court. President Trump, with this judicial insurrection that's quickly becoming a judicial coup. We update you every day on activities related to this, because that's really the main front of battle, as AOC and Bernie Sanders run around with being an American institution and really there to serve American citizens and this country. Colombia, yesterday, President Trump went after Colombia, withheld $400 million. There's no long 6-month fight. There's no 2-year fight. They're not to the barricades. They folded almost immediately. This is a lesson that these institutions that talk so tough and going to be so tough will collapse when you hold the money. People have advised President Trump and talked to President Trump, and people in the White House say, go to get a chokehold on him. And President Trump, who is a tremendous negotiator and really knows where leverage is, went right.
So what kind of a relationship does Donald Trump have with Steve Bannon? According to Michael Wolff, they've only seen each other in person one time over the past 8 years, but they do talk on occasion.
To it. Let me repeat, Columbia University is cratered. And on the surface, yeah, they're going to hire more security guards, going to do this. They cratered. The White House and Donald Trump broke them. And almost being private equity, they've merged with private equity. And the financial capital of the world is essentially run powerhouse law firms. New York City, because that's the political capital of the empire and rules over the country, as you know, as an imperial master. New York City, the financial capital of the world.
Right. Even if you don't have an ideological or political bone in this fight, how do you not enjoy seeing masters of the universe, right, get humiliated?
Is essentially run by the investment banks, the hedge funds, where all the hedge fund guys came out of the investment banks, and the law firms. And the law firms have started to transition to almost being private equity. They've merged with private equity and become these entities that are lethal to this nation and this republic. The combination of this private equity combined with these powerhouse massive law firms. Paul Weiss' revenues was $2.6 billion. And this is a renowned liberal law firm. I think it's the first law firm historically, traditionally, to have a Jewish partner work with a non-Jewish partner, because back in the post-war, pre-war, but post-war era, it was quite segregated about the Jewish law firms and the white shoe law firms, the Brahmin law firms, the mix being too dumb to get into the good law schools, so they were working the low end, the bucket shop trading desk. Paul Weiss, though, was the leader in coordinating, and the partner, I think his head name is Karp, was the leader among powerhouse law firms of organizing against Trump. And these aren't out front guys like Mark Elias or Bob Bauer. That's kind of more political. And Elias, and when you see people like that, it's that they are they're powerful, and that they get out in front and fight, and they can grit grassroots and organizations. The real power, as you always know, is behind the scenes. Paul Weiss was the railhead in the legal profession of the heavy-duty Wall Street, bringing the heat against Trump and everybody associated with Trump. Number one, to organize that no law firms are going to work for Trump people. A complete ban. Number two.
Right, so you see the Washington Post today bemoaning that Trump's opponents have a difficult time getting elite legal representation. No mention of how often Trump supporters, right, weren't able to get elite legal representation.
To make sure they're organized to take on any policy President Trump, any policy MAGA wanted to have. This is the hardest and toughest of the tough. This law firm is a killing machine legally. Trump broke them in 72 hours, and they genuflected. Karp, understand something. You went down and I don't know how your partners keep you around. This is to the 10th power worse than Schumer. He broke one of the most powerful men in this nation, broke him, and he went down like a little boy, like a supplicant, to beg forgiveness in the White House yesterday. I will tell you, the folks on Wall Street, I know the liberal Democrats, they are stunned by this. Their wins and their wins. Their victories and their victories. These two.
So notice how Steve Bannon, like me, likes to play some musical beds underneath his words, right? Us communication professionals, right? We know a thing or two.
It gets to the heart of the problem. Trump is on a roll like no one's ever been on a roll to sort this mess out and to set things right. Short break, back in the war minimum. Those places. Then you compete in those places, you get to the top of your class, you get connected, you get wired in, boom, you go to the next level. Paul Weiss, behind the scenes, so powerful, connecting corporate America. And here's what they did. The big law firms, with President Trump and his advisors, this has never happened in American history. This is how they were going to crush the Trump movement on two levels. Remember the billboards? If you see something, say something. Remember those days in January, the dark days? Let's not just forget President Trump, the lion and winter going back to Mar-a-Lago, but the complete assault on everybody. Down in Georgia, the billboards. Remember we brought up the film about the Stasi in East Germany. We used to talk about it other times, The Lives of Others. And if you haven't seen that, please get a chance to see that film, The Lives of Others, about people ratting on each other and how the secret police, that's what 21 was like, that's what 22 was like. For people around President Trump, the people around him. We were debanked, we were deplatformed, but you also couldn't get any representation. You had the Justice Department and all these people coming after you and going to run up millions of dollars in committees, in the phony J6 committee, everything. And Trump had nothing. This is Boris Epstein putting together really a pickup team because every law firm fired you. And Paul Weiss was at the tip of the spear. When he was in the Oval, buried lead in the New York Times article, President Trump brought that up to his face. Karp, the partners are Paul Weiss or turf you out immediately. You're a gutless coward. Behind the scenes, you're a big shot. You're a tough guy. You went to eviscerate this populist movement. Crush it, to kill it. Big talking. All these guys are so tough. This is why I went to prison. I was proud of it. Screw you. Not going to break me. You're not going to break Trump. You're not going to break us. We'll spit right in your eye. You're a big talker, dude. You went down. It is a total and complete humiliation for the partners of Paul Weiss and Bill Burke and all the guys that work with him that tried to last week try to get Covington and Burley, because this all came because they went after the law firms. I told you this was going to be huge. They went after the law firms. Perkins Coie, Covington and Burley, Paul Weiss. And they were all going to gang up and do all this stuff. You did nothing. You surrendered in 72 hours. In the power politics of this nation, this is one of the biggest victories ever. Remember, you talk about the Kennedy assassination, you talk about the deep state, you talk about John Foster Dulles, Sullivan, Cromwell. Go back and just connect. It's all the law firms. The law firms are the connective tissues, and the investment banks, Where do they all come out of? The Ivy League schools, into the investment banks, and the white shoe law firms. It's the reason the global financial capital. New York is senior. New York's the House of Lords to D.C.'s the House of Commons. The political apparatus. And this is why somebody the other day was giving me this thing about, the speech. About the populists coming together with the tech people, and we got to point the political class. The political class are basically puppets. They're doing what they're told. And most of it comes through the law firms because most of them are lawyers are going to bounce in and out of the law firms. The Paul Weiss partners, if you don't cashier Karp immediately, it shows you're all gutless. You're not tough. When exposed, and Trump says he's going to take your security clearance and cut off the money and you can't suck on the government tit anymore, you fold because you're greedy narcissists. You're not tough guys. You're not tough people. You act tough behind the scenes, but once you're out and put the spotlight on them, you went to the Oval Office and you groveled. And that's why MSNBC and New York Times behind the scenes, folks, these liberals and progressives that run this country are in shock because that's their hammer. That's their hammer. And they're in shock. 2, they never thought Columbia or Cola. They ought to go right now through the entire Ivy League like a sift through grass. You cut off Maine yesterday. Remember the governor of Maine, big talk. Oh, I'll see you in court. Okay, baby. We'll see you in court. We're going to cut all your money off first, see how that is. Blow out some of this Marxist faculty. They all talk big because they're all getting government money. They're getting your money to suppress you and your children. And they're all big talk until you expose them. It's all about money and power. You cut the money off, you see how much power they got. They don't have any. They grovel. Oh, I can't make that payment on that that beach house in the Hamptons, man. I got the wife all over me. We got to stop this. They all talked. The New York Times lays it all out because the New York Times is in shock. They talked and they said, oh, my God, this guy's serious. He cut us off. That's going to have a huge implication. We could be down 30% in revenue. Paul Weiss, you suck. And you're a group of cowards. Your entire professional life, everything you've done. I hope your children look at you and go, Daddy, why are you a coward? You are cowards. Perkins Coie next. Covington Burley next. Break them. Cut them off from all government money, all government funding. They said in the filing, they went to court. We will be bankrupt. This is 90% of our revenue. Yeah, exactly. Trump is so good. And to give the devil his due, the folks around him that have are now in the Justice Department, some of them, the rest on the outside, magnificent. Not good, magnificent. To put together a pickup team in those years of 21 and 22 and to be ready for the onslaught of 22 and 23, it will go down in history in the legal profession of a change in this country. No quality law firms. When Trump had him in the Oval, said, you, Karp, made sure that no law firm I could retain a law firm. The President of the United States of America, a man that had brought peace and prosperity to this country in his first term. Think about what 2019 was like. Even think of getting us through the pandemic as well as he could. Think about if Biden had been in charge. We'd still been in lockdown. They got corporate America and the big law firms that represent them and the investment banks to try to destroy Donald Trump. Guess what? You didn't destroy him. You did not destroy the people around him. Although you tried, you didn't destroy this movement. We're back bigger than ever. And yes, this is come retribution for the nation. Not personally. Not personally. Trump knows exactly what the problem is. That's why you get to do the pro bono work. This is like the reorganization of the FBI or the Justice Department. This is the public version of what they're doing in the Justice Department to redo it. Because the lawyers do control the country. They're the most ill-equipped people to do it. If you gave me a choice between being governed by the first 100 people that walked into these rallies, one of these rallies, or one of these, a super ballot chase that's got, he broke. And this is the lesson. They all talk tough. What does Mike Tyson say? Everybody's got a strategy. They're all talking. Because they got strategy. Columbia's got a big strategy. They're going to have a strategy, and they're going to hunker down. They're not going to fold to what President Trump wants. Paul Weiss, that guy was calling. They're going to get all these different firms, and like he did before to unite against President Trump. He's going to unite them again, and Paul Weiss is going to be the leader, and they're going to be Perkins Coie and Covington Burling and Quinn Emanuel and all of it. They're going to lead a big effort, and they're going to do this, and then 24 hours later, full frickin' surrender. We broke them at the polls in November. They're not that tough. They will break. This is about fragility. This is about resilience. You are resilient. Your human agency makes you resilient. You are tough, handed down in grit and determination. And they are not tough. They are soft. They're whiny. Look at these town halls. They're whiny. They're soft. They're not tough. They're not hard. You want to save this nation. You want to save this.
All right. I don't play much normally from Steve Bannon, but this is the most I played of Steve Bannon I put together in the last 4 years, but he's nailing something here.
Milwaukee's North Side.
I'm not knocking on doors about the upcoming election happening April 1st. Were you interested in voting?
Losing in November still stings.
Sent back. There's about 279,000 total.
Okay. Who am I a big fan of? Big fan of Christopher Caldwell. So you're probably asking, 40, you're putting in so much effort right now playing these videos. What is the temperature in your room? I am so glad you asked. I got the air conditioning going full bore because it is so damn tiring. Like using my finger to click play on these videos. You think that I can just do that without breaking a sweat, without the artificial enhancement of air conditioning? So if I wasn't engaged in the slog and just the brutal physical challenge of pressing play on certain videos, right, the temperature in this room would be 10 degrees warmer, right? It'd be like on Bondi Beach, but because I'm engaged in such intense intellectual labor right now, pressing my finger on a mouse, that the harder I work, right, the cooler the temperature I need to produce this kind of optimal performance, right? You think this is easy?
Tourist centers, but if you go any place agricultural, like southern Italy or Catalonia, you get off in a back road and you go into a farming area, and you'll see encampments, villages full of Africans. You don't see them on the main roads. They ride around in bikes. They have their local stores, but the agricultural sector of Europe is increasingly run by migrant labor.
Yeah. So what is your core
about democracy?
I like Vivek, but I am 100 times more interested in what Mr. Caldwell says. So it is these intense, demanding, tough, gut-wrenching decisions about what I will play for you that demands that I have the air conditioner running, even though it increases global warming.
Where people say, yes, we vote, but once we vote, there are all sorts of tricks and ruses to take actual agency away from us. And so I think that populism in the United States and in Europe is about that in both places, but the ruses are a little bit different. Part of the argument of my Age of Entitlement book is that the civil rights state, the idea that what you vote is valid only so long as it doesn't interfere with some judge's idea of people's rights, that has done a lot to let's say, reduce the actual democratic content of democracy in America. I think in Europe, I think that the European Union, which is a different type, it's it's a.
Whoa, that was intense. I mean, does he have a license for that opinion? He just said that civil rights legislation reduced democracy in America. He is claiming that there's a tension between civil rights legislation and democracy in America. Gosh, is that true? Because I didn't hear this in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal or the New Republic or the Atlantic. Wow, so the more civil rights legislation we have, the more that rights are expanded for certain privileged groups, the rights for other people, such as freedom of association, freedom who they employ, right, freedom who they rent to, the freedom of the use of their property and of their speech and of their private lives is reduced, and the less democracy people have, the more civil rights people have. Gosh, that's a revolutionary thought. Oi, mate, do you have a license for this opinion? I mean, do you have a credential to say such things? Very disturbing.
Transnational grouping of 27 European countries into a trading bloc. That has performed the same function. Basically, you vote for something like, I want fewer immigrants in France, and you're told that you can't have it because the European Court of Justice or the Court of Justice of the European Union, there are two of them, doesn't approve of it. So
I don't know about you, but as soon as I hear the European Court of Justice doesn't approve of something, then I just squelch my own natural inclinations. I would never want to go against the European Court of Justice. To me, that is the epitome of all that is righteous and good. But other people are not as subservient as I am.
That the 1964 Civil Rights Act basically vindicates the claims of the 14th Amendment, which is sort of equal protection of the laws, at the expense of the First Amendment, which is freedom of association, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly. So that's
gosh, this is really heavy. He seems to be saying that rights and virtues and different notions of what is righteous and good often compete with each other. He seems to be saying that moral virtues exist in a constellation where they're frequently in tension.
That's fascinating to me. That's very I mean, that's a big claim you just made.
Fascinating, big claim. Wow.
Named a Harvard law professor named Herbert Wexler, I believe, and he said that it's not really a very strong freedom of association claim to claim that people have the right to go to any school they want because other people have the right not to. They're on one side are people who want an association, on the other side are people who don't want it, and so you wind up making that choice, making what at the time was considered a First Amendment choice for people, because at the time, freedom of association was considered that was implied in the First Amendment. One of the things my book does is extrapolate forward from the 64 Civil Rights Act through the broadening of the stuff that it covered. Now, sex was in the Civil Rights Act, but the way people began to enforce equality for women was, I think, that something that nobody had envisioned in 1964. And so you get an issue where you say a woman has the right, you have very few female executives in this corporation. A woman has a right to be there. It constitutes a hostile environment, something that in the 80s or 90s, for this man to hang a girly picture in his office because he's an executive.
Wow, so when you expand the rights of women and you mandate certain results for women and other favored groups, it comes at the expense of the rights of other people, and it reduces social trust and social cohesion. It instigates massive amounts of government regulation of our private decisions. It creates incentives for massive amounts of litigation. It puts people at odds with one another. It reduces social cohesion and social trust. Gosh, I'm no longer so certain that civil rights is really worth this price.
And so you have a woman's right to work in that corporation, compromising the man's right to express himself in the corporation, which, of course, you've written whole books about. So I don't want to, bore your readers by telling them stuff they've probably heard here before.
One of the things I've discovered about books, you've been in the book writing business.
But you wind up with a sort of a differential application of that law. If one of the employees came in with a rainbow sweater and said that it was for Pride Day, I think he was on much shakier ground telling that employee not to wear it. So you wind up...
In fact, he'd see the same legal liability there if a Christian employee said that this makes me uncomfortable and is a microaggression to me and discrimination on the basis of religion and creating a hostile religious work. Otherwise puzzling outcomes of a business engaging in speech discrimination, which wasn't actually the business doing it. It was the business responding to the legal conditions.
But it's complex because it's not about regulation, deregulation. It's about it's about unequal treatment of two kinds of behavior in the workplace, according to terms that are kind of opaque, are very legalistic and opaque to the average citizen. So it leaves the average citizen feeling...
Whoa. So gosh, he isn't saying that perhaps it's in lawyers' interests and in big law's interests to keep a lot of things complicated and opaque, just as mortgage companies, when they extend a mortgage, the more complicated they can make the terms and the conditions and the document that you sign, right? The more scope they have to steal from you and abuse you and take advantage of you. So the more opaque the law, right, the more scope for the power, prestige, and income of lawyers. But is this really aligned with our national interest? Gosh, listening to this makes me more sympathetic to the populist anti-elite crowd. And I really want to be on the side of the angels and on the side of Harvard and the New York Times. But listening to Mr. Caldwell here, I'm thinking a second time.
A lot of fear because what he's allowed to do has to be explained to him by a specialist,
The only area where I might have a shade of disagreement with you, and I am...
Wow, a specialist? You mean we need credentials and ever more formal education, and then education is largely about going along with getting educated, meaning repeating back to a teacher what he wants to hear. And so this sounds like civil rights has created a society that is more complicated, more opaque, where relations between groups are more difficult, that we have ever more needs for regulation, government intrusion, litigation, certification, bureaucratization. Doesn't sound super fun, bro.
That somebody couldn't wear a red sweater to work in celebration of veterans.
Those debates were all had.
Those debates were had.
Yeah.
And none of the people who voted for the Civil Rights Act imagined that's exactly what they were enacting. Yet you've got the EEOC, which then says, no, this is decades later. That's actually what the law says, is this woman can't wear the red sweater because somebody else in the workplace finds that to be microaggression. Yeah. Nobody passed the Civil Rights Act would have imagined that that's exactly the way it would be interpreted.
But then you get a judge who says, according to the red sweater rule, this other person is entitled to do something for his office furniture. And so
that's exactly right.
The judge then escalates the rule by a notch, and then you get a new rule.
Gosh, do judges enjoy power? Do judges enjoy prestige? Do bureaucrats enjoy power and prestige? Do judges and bureaucrats and professions and attorneys like using their credentials and their place in the current institutional framework to enhance their own group interests, their own ideology, their own status and income at the expense of the rest of us? Because that's kind of what I'm sensing here.
Rule to raise it another quantum. And so
that's right.
You get a ratchet effect.
But all of that happened
legislation.
Without legislation. But all of that happened in part in the judicial side of this.
It's not limited to EU countries. It's kind of a human rights court that's...
I wish there was software I could just cut Vivek completely out of this interview.
That's standards for the developed world. The Court of Justice of the European Union tells the countries what the laws of the European Union are. I can give you, there was a very interesting case just this week. The Court of Justice of the European Union established a right to have a right against dead naming or whatever, a right to have your acquired gender recognized in other European countries. There was a case involving, and I don't know which direction this person was going. I think it was from female to male. She became a male.
So Paul Weiss has housed many of our most brilliant legal minds, including the devastatingly lovely and charming Roberta Kaplan, who led the prosecution against the Charlottesville rioters. Right? She was a big muck at Paul Weiss. Paul Weiss gave birth to the Roberta Kaplan that we have with us today. Thank you so much, Paul Weiss.
A trans man in the UK, which then fell out of the European Union with Brexit. She was a Romanian-born woman. She returned to her home country and found that they did not recognize her sex change. And I may be getting the sex backwards here. I beg your pardon for that. But the court ruled that Romania actually had to, once this sex change was done in another European country, they had to give full faith and credit to it. So it is that's a good example.
And it's legally binding, not overrideable by the nation state.
That's right. It's like a federal issue. It's a full faith and credit clause, even though they don't have a full faith and credit clause, but they're acquiring these things through judicial activism.
Yeah. See, and I think that partly explains, I think,
the assumption that those states' rights are inevitably going to disappear into a federalized, centralized authority. And they're just running the machine to claim those rights along the way and assuming that the people in these countries are not going to notice. And for a very long time, they didn't notice, but now they do. But there's another thing that happened is that before our Civil War, I think our states were arguably growing together, and slavery was an obstacle to their growing together. I am not sure the European states are growing together in that way.
Mm. So, what do you think that portends for the future of the EU as an alliance?
We designed the euro, but it's too late to change it now. And there's an attempt to do the same thing with debt now. There was the great priority for Brussels is to create mutualized debt obligations that, for one, are going to make it hard to disentangle the countries financially, but for another, are a tremendous stick to be waved over the head of governments. So during COVID, Brussels created a $1 trillion COVID recovery plan, and basically it put all these countries on the hook for proportionate to their population, and then paid them the money out to do not whatever plan they chose, but a plan involving green energy. Any country could do whatever it wanted in order to build green energy. But having control over this, Brussels said, well, look, Poland, we will give you your $60 billion, which is your share of this, but only if you change your way of making court decisions and things. So it basically created a bias towards the European centralizing forces. You see, it kind of worked the way our block granted federal funds to states used to work before they were, when the federal government was really irresponsible. But anyway, there's a grip on the individual countries that Brussels has through money.
Mm-hmm. So you think they're using sort of the fiscal weakness of certain of the countries, if not all of the non-German countries?
Yeah, Germany's looking pretty
home and digital channels, or use a VPN or whatever it is, and it starts to look.
But when people say you have to leave your home because you can't afford it anymore, you kind of get angry.
Yeah, right. And I think that's really, I think, the interesting point. I think relating to Western Europe, I'd love to probe on, but even lessons for the United States is
kind of peasanty truths. I think about like how to about how it's maybe more valuable.
Okay, this was tough to swallow. Let me just rewind.
Reopen a lot of questions that we thought were closed.
Okay, Here we go.
Is a formula for catalytic change, but I'd ask you for your perspective, both on the other side of the pond as well as ours, for what's really going on there.
That is my perspective. I mean, you talk about yes. I mean, we are going to reopen a lot of questions that we thought were closed.
Interesting.
I mean, people talk about, the popularity of books about civilizations and how civilizations decline both in the United States and in Europe. And basically, we've done what our grandparents warned us against. We've traded a certain amount of independence, and we traded independence for comfort, which is a trade that's always available to people. And we now, having traded away our independence, we now find we don't have enough independence to sustain our comfort. And so we're going to have to relearn some more kind of peasanty truths, I think, about like how to, about how it's maybe more valuable to build things than to dream things up, or about how you have to get up in the morning and do real work and that kind of stuff.
I think that framing is interesting, right? We've traded our independence for comfort. Now, I think if you play this out, if you no longer have the comfort, then you're not going to trade off your independence, like not even a little bit, which creates, that's the backdrop of social unrest, because it gets to the second part, which you said we're about to reopen a lot of questions that you thought were closed. Yes. If the question was closed, that at least creates a status quo of stability, maybe a stable equilibrium that you don't love, but everybody, at least prefers stability to not. But if your point is that I'm no longer getting the comfort that was the backbone of that trade-off, I'm going to go back and relitigate some of those questions that we thought was water under the bridge, which is really a formula for turmoil, social turmoil outright. Where are you seeing that in Europe? Where do you see evidence of that in Europe? Do you see early vestiges of that happening, or do you think this is still, still skating to where the puck is going a little bit, but we're not quite there?
We're skating to where the puck is going, I think. Well, look, where I see it is that these so-called populist groups have triumphed in many. I wouldn't say they've triumphed in very few countries, but they have become the top party in many countries. And I think that these issues are being reopened. I mean, the fact that a right-wing party can be elected in Germany is really extraordinary. The fact that a right-wing party can be elected, they're not elected, but can top the polls in Austria is also extraordinary. You have a right-wing government in Italy. You also had a government, I think, the one that was elected in 2018, was even more right-wing than it is now. You have Hungary. You have the bottom falling out of the left in Ireland. I mean, I think you have the revolt against the government in France. You have the rise of the center-right in Belgium. You have Geert Wilders in Holland. You have the Sweden Democrats playing a part in the government in.
So this conversation took place 5 months ago.
In Sweden, it goes on and on and on, and with the exception of I'd say England and Poland, the continent is really moving right.
If you've liked the conversation so far, I'd encourage you to buy my latest book.
Perhaps unwisely, probably unwisely, Macron called national elections,
right?
Which people sort of suspected, looking at the way the polls were looking, were going to bring the National Front to power. The reason they thought that is that France has elections that follow the same system that we follow in Louisiana, right? Mm-hmm. You have a 2-round, you have an open first round, and then the top people who get over a certain threshold, which is usually either 2, to get a national rally seat, a Le Pen seat, as it did to get a Popular Front seat, a left-wing seat. So it was a trick. And then
it was an anti-democratic move, actually.
In spirit, although it was quite legal. It's a kind of a...
Well, it's legal, but it was anti-democratic in its spirit. Yeah, nobody's saying it's not.
But the thing that really topped it off is having used the hard left to keep the right wing out of power. Macron then appointed a right-wing premier, a person on the right of the old, let's call it the center right, let's say the Mitt Romney type rump of the French right. He appointed a guy who would be acceptable to the national rally, because if he's not acceptable to Le Pen, the government will fall. So it's moving every which way, and he has the Macron has gained the reputation of someone who will say almost anything,
Right. And he's able to
independence for comfort. People were in
comfort being a treaty and a bargain that no longer holds. There's a new equilibrium.
Yes.
a disequilibrium at least coming in Europe.
But people are going to have to relearn to be peasants, basically.
Yeah. How interesting. What do you mean by that?
I mean that, during this period of bartering away independence for comfort, people were encouraged to, listen to these new schemes. It's like, oh, here's green energy. It's like, it's gonna seem like your energy is costing more, but it's not really gonna cost more because if you blah blah blah. And people were like looking and trying to figure out what's going which way. And eventually, I think that they've sort of developed the sense that they've been had. And so voters are developing the psychology that peasants had in like 19th century novels by Balzac. Someone walks up to your door and says, look, I'll offer you $10 million for your farm. It's like, nope, nope, I'm not going to listen to you. For me to get engaged in a sort of like conversation with you, even if you're being nice to me, even if what you are offering me seems good to me, I'm not going to do it. I'm just going to say nope. And that's what and so I think that it's an interesting thing in this country. You look at these two huge debates we've had in which in each of them, one side seems to have drubbed the other, and yet they had no effect on the polls or anything. There's nothing. It's like people have stopped listening, and that's a sign of something, I think.
What do you think it is?
Okay, so he's talking about the debate between Trump and Kamala Harris and the debate between, I assume, either Trump and Biden or J.D. Vance and Tim Walz.
Sign of.
Well, I think it's a sign of peasantization, of like people have been kind of like led down the garden path too many times, and they're just not going to. They're going to vote as they see fit. They're not going to listen to a plan or a project of any kind because it's either not going to happen or it's going to happen for someone else's benefit.
I think that this bargain in the United States is one where
here's what they did.
I mean, this is deep stuff. I think for the future of even the conservative movement and what direction we take. Are we actually willing to say to the voter, you've been screwed by the nanny state arrangement, and then that involves taking some of the cocaine away, to use that as an analogy or whatever, some pleading from, like you say, coke addict, you take the coke away, the first reaction is not going to be great, but it's what needs to be done for his own betterment in the long run.
Yes, but there's a difference because when you take the coke away, you assume that the society is still there, the employment market is still there, everything. If you can just keep the guy clean, there is stuff for him out there. But a lot of this nanny state that you described has involved our unlearning how to do these things ourselves. Like, how do you save for a retirement? You think like, I didn't know I was going to have to save for a retirement. It's going to, and now I'm almost retired. And what am I going to do? That attitude. You can't ask a person like that to just go out and make that leap of faith. I mean, this was always the problem with the welfare state, certainly with the retirement part of the welfare state, which I think is now the biggest part, is that at the very start, you had a generation that got to collect without paying in. And at the very end, you're going to have a generation that pays in without collecting. And so
it's just math. Yeah.
So right. So I think that what has to happen is that
but just punctuate that point even further. So you have a generation that pays in without collecting, but against the backdrop of being told that they had to cede their sovereignty on issues.
That this can be eventually resolved. And it can be an electoral platform for some presidential candidate.
The big law firms with President Trump and his advisors, this has never happened in American history. This is how they were going to crush the Trump movement on two levels. Remember the billboards? If you see something, say something. Remember those days in January, the dark days? Let's not just forget President Trump, the Lion and Winter going back to Mar-a-Lago, but the complete assault on everybody. Down in Georgia, the billboards. Remember we brought up the film about the Stasi in East Germany. We used to talk about it other times, the lives of others. And if you haven't seen that, please get a chance to see that film, The Lives of Others, about people ratting on each other and how the secret police. That's what 21 was like. That's what 22 was like. For people around President Trump, the people around him. We were debanked, we were deplatformed, but you also couldn't get any representation. You had the Justice Department and all these people coming after you and going to run up millions of dollars in committees and the phony J6 committee, everything. And Trump had nothing. This is Boris Epstein putting together really a pickup team because every law firm fired you. And Paul Weiss was at the tip of the spear when he was in the Oval. Buried lead in the New York Times article, President Trump brought that up to his face. Karp The partners are Paul Weiss or turf you out immediately. You're a gutless coward. Behind the scenes, you're a big shot. You're
Okay, that will do it for now. I'll talk to you later.